All right, hello everybody. Hopefully, we'll get a few people here. Get this camera lined out. It's not wanting to focus, so let's see if it'll straighten up. There we go. I think we got it. So, I just want to take a minute as we're getting some viewers here checking in and getting ready to have a good study here tonight. I want to take a minute to thank you all for being with us tonight. I know that this is something that I look forward to, and it's been pretty hard to do this the last few weeks. So I know you can't see this, but I'm trying to keep my leg up. so hopefully we'll be able to make it through an hour of this. But either way, we're going to talk about some things that are related to eschatology tonight, and I'm very thankful that you are here. This is the purpose of this particular time that I set aside once a week to do this for an hour or so, and I'll try to keep it to that tonight. But what we do is we're looking at what the scriptures say, and the topic tonight obviously is they lied to you about the second coming of Jesus. And I'll take just a minute to explain that here as we get going. But I do want to say hello to several people that are checking in already. I see Brother Scott Clapp there, good man. Love him and his wife and the good work that he's doing and they're doing for the Lord. So appreciate you like crazy, brother. And you just you keep on keeping on. We see Stephen Witzett's joined us. Let's see, Leon and Scott and Dorothy and Nancy, and it's just too many. See somebody here that's very special to me, my niece Brooke. So it's awful fantastic to see you here. Charles and Jim and Eva and Philip and Annette Morgan and David Gates, just a very classy group of people here with us tonight, and good old high school chum there, Bert Spillman, and I'm sure we'll gain more as we go along. But you see here this topic, and we'll just go ahead and get right into this. They lied to you about the second coming of Jesus. Yes, yes, I'm going to admit something right now. That's clickbait. Okay, all right, just all it is to it. You have to have a catchy title in order to get people to watch. Now this and I hate to admit that, but that's the way it is. People love controversy, but I guarantee you this topic is controversial. No question about this, and there's a good chance that most of the people that will be listening tonight and that will view this are going to totally disagree with me. That's okay. You disagree with me. But my goal is to get you to open your Bible and see what the scriptures have to say, not what men have been teaching us, but what the scriptures have to say. There's the bottom line. That's all we really want. So we have been lied to, and I want to explain this. We have been lied to about the second coming of Jesus. We have been told many years, 2,000 years, essentially, the majority of people have said that Jesus is coming in our future. People today are still teaching, though Jesus said he was coming in the lifetime of the people in the first century, yet people today, preachers stand up in the pulpit and completely and totally defy what Jesus said, and guess what they do? They're saying that no, that's not what Jesus said. That's certainly not what he meant. That didn't work out so good. So let me tilt that back up. Okay, so I understand that a lie really, and Tony actually made this comment on my teaser post. I understand that a lie is essentially intentional, and there are a lot of good people that are well-meaning, and I was one of those for a very long time, and I taught a lie. It was an untruth, but I have to say this: it was still a lie. I mean, and let me put it this way, and I can speak from my perspective. So I'm going to talk from my perspective. So teaching this idea, I've been preaching full time for 23 years, I think. So teaching this idea that Jesus was coming back in my future, in our future, I know was not the truth, especially now that I look back on it. So hey there, David and Scott. The answer, what? Yeah, you get it. Okay, so Was I lying to people? Yes and no. I wasn't doing it intentionally, but I was teaching people something that the scriptures do not teach. That's a lie. That it's a lie that's been perpetuated, and I, in honesty and sincerity, bought into it. So you might be asking yourself, especially if this is something you've never heard, you might be asking yourself, what on earth are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about it like this. Jesus said his, for lack of a better term, I'm going to use a popular modern day term, that his second coming would be in the lifetime of the people in the first century, not in our lifetime. So here's the problem that we run into. We run into this problem of reading the scriptures like they're written to us today. So when we read something that says that Jesus is coming, we think, oh, well, that means that he's coming in our future because it says he's coming. But what you have to understand is this was written 2,000 years ago, roughly. So this was written to people that lived 2,000 years ago. Now, none of those people are still alive and on this planet. And there's many, many, many proofs we're going to look at here. But I'm here to tell you tonight, as shocking as this might be, that the simple fact of the matter from a scriptural standpoint is Jesus said he would return his parousia for the life in the lifetime of the people that he was talking to. I know that that's not going to sit well with a lot of people, but you have to look. If you're an honest Bible student, you're going to look at what the Bible says, and you're going to accept what Jesus says. Now, I thought I was an honest Bible student, and let me say this, okay? I thought that Jesus was coming in the future, and I was honest about that. But I have to be honest, and I can tell you this from my experience too. I have spoke to many, many preachers, and we've spoken about this very subject many times. And when I would ask them, what does it mean? I'll never forget asking a preacher. He's probably 20 years older than me, maybe. Matter of fact, he just passed away. I had a lot of respect for him. And I'll tell you why I had respect for him when you'll see why when I tell you this story. So I asked him, this has been 20 years ago, at least, maybe a little more. And matter of fact, it was at the baptism of my children, baptized all three of them at the same time, 4 in one setting. One young man that might have as well been my own child at the time anyway. So we baptized all of them. So we had to use their congregation because our building didn't have a baptistry. We didn't have one. So after the baptism, I asked him, what does it mean? So I mean, I know the answer now, but I asked him, what does it mean? Jesus is going to come back with 10,000s of his holy ones or 10,000s of his saints. And here's my question to him, because I was legitimately Bible study. I wanted to know. Okay. So I said to him, I asked him that question from 1 Thessalonians 4 and also from Jude and so forth. Okay. So I asked him about that. And I said, brother, if Jesus, or if we're going to be resurrected when Jesus comes back, how can he bring us with him? He blew me off at that time. He blew me off. And he said, well, look at his watch and I got to go and all this other stuff. And then we'll talk about it later. This is exactly what he said. And we never did talk about it later. So another couple of years passed, and we used their baptistry again. Of course, we'd used it several times before, and I kept waiting for him to answer me. So at this particular time, about 2 years later, I asked him if he had been thinking about that, and he said he hadn't. And you know what he did? This is why I respect him. He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know. He didn't have an answer for it. So at least I had respect for him. But my point about that is, when you look at what Jesus said, it's confusing. It's confusing when you look at what Jesus says. And matter of fact, just turn to Matthew 16, verse 27, 28. We'll start with this. These are the words of Jesus. And Jesus says, I'm coming in your lifetime for my parousia. All right. Parousia, get this. If you look it up in the Strong's or pretty much whoever you want to look it up in, they're going to rely heavily on the fact that when it's referred to regarding Jesus, it's about his advent. Okay, what's his advent? This is his second coming, when he is going to come for the second time. Now, I think that's just a fine term, actually, from Hebrews chapter 9, verse 26 through 28. If you look at that, he said he's appear for the second time. Okay, so I don't have a problem with that. But when I say that, that puts us all on the same page. Okay, so here we go. Matthew 16, 27 and 28. So Jesus says the Son of Man is about to, if your Bible says going to, that's incorrect. You have to look at it. And this is one of the things about Bible study. Okay, you're going to have to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the translation that you choose. There's no way around that. I don't care which translation you pick. You're going to have to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of it. And the only way to do that is by comparing it as close as you possibly can to the original language it was written in, Hebrew or Greek or whatever. And you can do that by going to Bible Hub, right? And just do a Google search of Matthew 16. You type in Matthew 16 interlinear, and then go to Bible Hub's got a great interlinear. And then you can go there and you can see the original words. You can look up the definitions. You can see how they're parsed in the Greek and so forth. And before you know it, you'll start becoming familiar with these. And you'll see that this word here in Matthew 16, verse 27, should be the Son of Man is about to come. Now, see, this is where this has really messed us up. And we read passages where the translators have really, really, really done us a huge disservice. Like, for example, in Matthew 24. We're going to go back to Matthew 16, but I just want to show you about how the translators inject their personal bias or their personal beliefs into these things and set aside the original text. So in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, we read the apostles ask Jesus, they say 3 questions. It's really just one question in 3 parts. It's one question, all dealing with the same issue, because Jesus had just been talking about the temple being destroyed. So here's what they say. He was sitting on the Mount of Olives, Matthew 24:3. The disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? If you're reading the King James and a few other versions. Well, you might say, well, that's a good translation. The King James is the only right Bible. Really? Then why did they intentionally change this word? Even in the translation that was used before the King James Bible and the translation that the Latin Vulgate that they used to translate the King James Bible, they still changed it, okay? Because in that, they used the consummation of the world or of the ages. Now, in our language, when we say the word world, we think of the physical planet. 2,000 years ago, you could use the word world, and even still today, for those who understand this, will use the word world to mean something other than not the literal world. But if you look at just about every translation, and I believe even the New King James changed this to what it should have been, not the end of the world, but the end of the age. So when you have these translators that really inject their own personal bias into the text, it creates a problem for the masses who really buy into that translation and believe that they're not going to let's see. James Boswell, great to see you, by the way. So I'm glad you're able to be with us tonight. I can't keep up with all these comments. I'll try, but I just can't. So so these translators have really caused us a lot of problems. Now let's go back to Matthew 16, verse 27, 28. The Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Okay, so here's what Jesus said. There are some standing here who will not die until they see these events take place. In other words, verse 27 and 28 are the same thought. Now, I know the popular thing to do is to take this and make these 2 verses divorced from one another. Why would you do that? Are you going to divorce the entire context, 24 through 28? Or are you just going to stop at 24 to 27 and say, well, that's talking about the same thing? Or are you going to say 24 through 26 is talking about one thing, 27 is talking about another thing, and 28 is talking about something else? That's disingenuous, and that is dishonest Bible study. In other words, what you're doing when you do that is you're forcing your opinion into the text and into the context and into the scripture there. That's called eisegesis. And that's dangerous. So here's what we have to look at. We have to look at and we have to accept what Jesus said. It's just that simple. Here's what Jesus said. I am coming back for judgment with my angels in your lifetime. Let's read this again. The Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels. He will repay every man according to his deeds. Okay, so what happens when Jesus comes on the clouds with his angels for judgment? My friends, that is the resurrection. That's the judgment day is inextricably tied to resurrection. You cannot have judgment and the day of judgment of the just and the unjust, every man according to his deeds. You cannot have that divorced from the resurrection. And you might say, John, you have lost your mind. And you wouldn't be the first person to tell me that, especially not on this subject. You know, a lot of people have really, Philip every eye, by the way, did see Jesus in Revelation 1 and verse 7. If you read it for the context, in the context, and maybe we'll have time to get to that, but I want to stay on this thought here for just a moment. Okay, so here you go. We just laid it out. Now let's look at the context of this. So let's go back to verse 24 in Matthew chapter 16. What's the context? Because a lot of people have ridiculed me and said, "Oh, well, you're not keeping it all in context." Okay, well, let's see what the context is. So, if anyone who wishes to come after me must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man, as we just read just a moment ago. Okay, so if you look at verse 27, the word for, I believe, is the Greek word gar, if I'm pronouncing it right. And it's connecting this. Okay, so you've got this tribulation that's going to take place. This prophets are going to be killed. Martyrs are going to be people are going to be martyred, and then this vindication is going to take place. When does that happen? Does that happen in the future? You know, people in the Church of Christ, which I come from, obviously, believe the amillennial position. So they hold this position that says that Jesus is going to come back in the future with absolutely no signs. Just bam, all of a sudden, and the sky rolls back, and or the clouds roll back, and it's rolled back like a scroll, and Jesus descends with the sound of a trumpet. There's no warning whatsoever. But yet Jesus says that the martyrs are going to be vindicated at the time of his coming. What does that mean? Jesus said when these martyrs when this would happen. So let's look at a couple passages. Let's go over here to Matthew chapter 10. In Matthew chapter 10, I want you to see here what Jesus told his apostles, these very people that he was talking to, right? So in verse 21, he says, brother will betray brother to death. A father, his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all because for my name, because it's the one who has endured to the end who will be saved. Boy, this is sounding familiar, isn't it? But whenever they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. So what was he talking about? He was talking about this persecution that was going to take place. He was talking about the persecution. He said, you would not even finish going through the cities of Israel. In other words, you're persecuted in one city and you flee to the next, and they start persecuting you and you flee to the next. What do we see? Remember, Paul was at, before he went to Berea, he was at Thessalonica. They chased him out. They were trying to kill him. So he goes to Berea, and then he preaches to those people, and some of them accept the truth. But then guess what? More persecution. So they're fleeing from city to city to city. That was taking place in the first century. Now, why is this all important? Because that keeps the context of Matthew chapter 16, 24 through 28 all together. And it's consistent with Matthew 10, which we just read. You will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. How's the Son of Man going to come? In the glory of his Father with his angels. I'm reading Matthew 16, verse 27. This is the exact same thing, right? For the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels. Did you notice, by the way, how when it uses the term about to come, that completely changes the time frame and the time element from about to and going to. Going to is way, way, way open-ended. But the term mello in the present, okay, that means this is getting ready to happen. It's in process. And that's what he was saying. The ball's already rolling. That snowball is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's rolling down the mountain right now, is what he says. That's the whole point. Okay, so Jesus said, I'm coming back with my angels for judgment of the just and the unjust in your lifetime. Some of you will be alive to see it. Okay, how do you get around that? So, were we lied to? I feel like I was lying to all of the people that were in my congregation and all the people that I talked to. And the sermon, I had this one sermon that I preached. It was called The Day the Lord Returned. And I preached that, I don't know, probably 3 times. And every time I preached that sermon, it was powerful. It was really, really powerful. And it made people really think about their life, and it scared them sockless, because all of a sudden, here they are faced with this fact, and I put that in quotes, that Jesus is getting ready to come back, and he's coming back in our lifetime. And I would just make that point and hammer it and beat it home, and people would walk out of there shaking, and they would say, I'm going to live my life better because Jesus could come at any time. And I feel terrible about telling them that lie. Did I intentionally lie to them? I didn't intentionally lie to them, but nonetheless, I told them a lie. Jesus is not coming in our future. The Bible was not written to us. You got to keep this in context. It was written to people 2,000 years ago. He names them by their names. He uses some individual names. He names them by the local congregations. None of those people or those congregations exist today. So when Jesus said, I'm coming back soon, and he wrote it to people 2,000 years ago, so that person that opened up this book, one of the elders, gets this letter from Paul or Peter or whoever, it doesn't matter. And it says, and there's talking about the Lord is on his way. He's getting ready to come. His parousia will happen at any time. What do you think that they honestly thought? That, oh, well, that means it's going to be a couple thousand years. No. No, they did not. They kept it in context. They knew when oh, this is just crazy. So Peter says in his second letter, he says, you're going to receive relief soon. You're going to be vindicated. The Lord's going to vindicate you for the people that are persecuting you. Do you honestly, truthfully read into that they believed it was going to be in 2,000 years, or it was going to be in their lifetime? Because it was consistent with the teachings of Jesus and Paul and the others that Jesus was coming in their lifetime. Why do you think in 1 Peter chapter 3, why do you think that they said, where's the promise of his coming? What promise? What promise? I mean, that's 2 Peter. Actually, I made reference to this being in 2 Peter. It was 2 Thessalonians, actually, about them being vindicated. But they were asking, where's the promise of his coming? Well, who made a promise to come in their lifetime? It was Jesus. So here you have these people scoffing against Christ, and they're ridiculing Christ. And Peter is taken up for him, and he's saying, the Lord is not slow about his promises as you count slowness. And then he quotes, what was that? Psalms chapter 90, I think. Wait a minute. What's the context? It was in the first century. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 16. We'll just base everything off of this tonight because we've been lied to. We've been sold a bill of goods. You realize that, right? When someone is telling you something directly opposite of what Jesus said, and you believe what they say and not what Jesus says, my friends, there's a huge, huge problem here. Huge. Because we have got to the point where we respect men over the Son of God. Now, so Jesus came, born of a virgin, as prophesied. He came at the appointed time, the correct time, at the consummation of the ages. He lived a perfectly sinful, sinless life. He was crucified as our Passover lamb. He made the atonement. He ascended into heaven to offer the atoning blood, which was his, being our priest. And then you are going to say he didn't keep his word. That's serious, serious stuff. Serious, serious stuff. So back to Matthew chapter 16, verse 27, 28. I'm just going to respect what Jesus said. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This is the exact same thing that is dealt with in Matthew chapter 24. Now, what you have to understand is Jesus deals with this time and time and time again. So let's look at Matthew chapter 24 and see what he was talking about. Now, keep in mind, what was the context of Matthew 16, there in verse 24 through 28? Jesus doesn't change gears. There's not three subjects going on there. This is, they're going to be persecuted. They're going to have to give up their lives, and they're going to have to make a choice. Are you going to give up your life? What would a man give in exchange for his soul? What's more important than your soul? Going along with what everyone else teaches, what everyone else believes, what they want you to do, or following the Son of Man? Which one is it? And he says, for the Son of Man is about to come. Now, this is exactly what he said in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24 is just a longer version of what he said in Matthew 10. It's just a longer version of what he says in Matthew 16. It's just a longer version of what he says in Matthew chapter 21. It's just a longer version of those things. And actually, we need to go back to Matthew chapter 23. This is still the Olivet Discourse, okay? This all leads up to this. So Matthew 23, 24, and 25, it's all the same subject matter. And you will say, well, there's a transition verse. Really? You got the same transition? If there's no transition verse in Matthew 10, and there's no transition in Matthew 16, and there's no transition in Matthew 21, and he's talking about the exact same thing in Matthew chapter 24, and we've already established the fact that the translators lied to us by putting the end of the world in there when it should be the end of the age. And Matthew 24 is exactly the same thing. The Olivet Discourse is all the same thing that we've already talked about. There's no transition verse, just like all the other things. Jesus doesn't have multiple theories, and he says you can just pick and choose about what you like. He doesn't have multiple theories. These are all consistent. That's why after Jesus died, ascended into heaven, and before he returned, that's why all of the apostles, all of the writers of the New Testament could, with unity, write about the exact same thing that they did. Peter wrote about it. 2 Peter 3 is a good example. Paul wrote about it to the Thessalonians. It's all over. James wrote about it. Jude wrote about it. It's written about it. Matter of fact, Revelation is the Olivet Discourse, just expanded sevenfold. Literally 7 times. It repeats the same thing. It's interesting. There's no transition verse. It's all talking about the same thing. And I know that people really want to make it say something that it doesn't. They want to protect their paradigm. They want to protect what they believe. We can't do that. To be an honest Bible student means that we're honest with ourselves when we are honest with the text. Let me put it this way. If you believe that Jesus is having his parousia, there you go, John, in the future, then how do you justify that when you look at the text? Think about it like this. An honest man, when he sees the truth, when confronted with the truth, has two options. He either accepts the truth or he ceases to be an honest man. We don't have any choice. If you're honest and you're going to follow what the scriptures say, you're going to have to look into this. Because a surface reading, if you just look at stuff up here on the top of the Bible, what you're going to see is not what Jesus was teaching, because you look at it through 21st century eyes. We look at it through the paradigm of our father and our grandfather. And if they were deceived and they were misled, then they're going to teach you something in honesty and sincerity that's honestly and sincerely wrong. And that can happen with all sorts of subjects. It happen with the plan of salvation, with baptism, with instrumental music, and so on and so forth. The plan of salvation, how we worship, and just a host of things, and eschatology as well, or the coming of the Lord. So it behooves us to be honest with the text, or we're going to cease to be an honest man. It's just that way. There's no other way around that. Okay, so here's what I want to show you from Matthew 23, 24, and 25. I'm not going to spend the rest of the time on this, but there's a great point to be made here. Now, so Matthew chapter 23, go back to verse 29, and Jesus, this is one of the 8 woes pronounced, right? So in verse 29, he says, "Woe to you," Matthew 23, 29, "scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." He calls them hypocrites. He says, "For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn them with monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets." Let's ask a question. Why did these people and their fathers shed the blood of the prophets sent by God? Look up the story of Micaiah. I think that's in 1 Kings 16 or something like that, or 6, I don't remember. But look up the story of Micaiah. He lived his life imprisoned. Why? Because he told the truth. He told the truth, and everybody knew it, and the kings knew it. And they said he always, I just went blank on all the names involved, but he's the one king said, he always prophesies against me. And Micaiah said, you want to know something? I'm going to tell you the truth. I'll tell you the truth. Even when everybody told him, don't you dare tell the truth. You go along with the other 100 or 400 of the other prophets, agree with them. And he said, I can only speak the things of God. Why did they kill the prophets? Because they didn't like the message. They didn't like to hear the truth. So these are the people of God killing the prophets of God. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Do you suppose man has changed much? Absolutely not. When it comes to someone telling you the truth and pointing out what Jesus simply said, that my parousia will be my advent, my second coming, by popular terminology, the return of the Lord is going to be in the lifetime of some of the people standing here that I'm talking to right now, and that was 2,000 years ago. If you look at that and you say that it means in the future, then you're taking what Jesus said and being very dishonest with it. Very. Just to protect, as the people in the first century did by killing the prophets. Doing the same thing. May not be killing them, but there are people, and I hate this. I never really had any conflict in my life until I started standing up for the Lord. Man, that speaks volumes. Speaks volumes. So when I started defending the Savior's very words, people started hating me. Just started hating me. And this was very strange for me. It was very difficult for me to deal with in the beginning. Now I've just learned, hey, people are going to either accept the truth or they're not. So we have to stand for the truth. Friends, listen to this. This is my impassioned plea to you. If you are a child of God, if you love Jesus and you love him with every fiber of your being, protect the very words that he spoke 2,000 years ago, and do not let it be adulterated by sinful man and his preconceived notions. Jesus said, I'm coming in your lifetime with my angels for judgment in the glory of my Father. I'll tell you what, friends, I'm siding with Jesus. You all can do whatever you want. I'm siding with the Lord, and I'm not going to back down. Just saying. Okay, so why did they kill the back to Matthew 23? Why did they kill them? They didn't like to hear the truth. They didn't want to hear the truth. So they just killed him. Okay, so let's continue reading here. He calls them hypocrites, right? This is Matthew 23. I started there in verse 29. Notice what he says there in verse 30. Or I'm sorry, 31. He says, so you testify against yourself that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. And he says, you are going to pay the price for the guilt of all of these generations for killing the prophets, for killing the people. This is what Jesus, the Son of God, is saying. You're killing the prophets that I sent to you and my Father sent to you to tell you the truth. You're killing them, and you are going to pay the price for all these generations. Deuteronomy chapter 32 prophesies that there would come a generation that was evil and adulterous and wicked, and that's the generation that Jesus lived in. And if you think that ever a more wicked generation could exist, you think about this. This generation killed the Son of God. It's never going to get any worse than that. They stood and they screamed and they shouted and they jeered and they said, we have no king but Caesar. Crucify him. They wanted to kill him. Get it? Was Jesus a prophet? That's right. He certainly was. Now, verse 34, 33, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of Gehenna? It's not hell. Matter of fact, I'll tell you this. If you look at the Greek and the Hebrew, we don't see hell anywhere in these 66 books. It's not there. Not hell. Okay, so it's Gehenna. That's a whole other study. I'm still trying to figure that one out myself. I still have paradigms I have to squash and follow just simply what the Lord says. Okay, so here's what we see. Verse 34, Matthew 23. Therefore, behold, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Who's that? Matthew 10. This is what Jesus said. You're going to kill and crucify them. And some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. This is Matthew chapter 10. Do you not see that? You're going to persecute them from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. And truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel until I come. Jesus said here in Matthew chapter 23, you're going to be persecuted going from city to city. Didn't we just read that? And these things are going to happen, what? In this generation. Matthew 16, verse 27 and 28 says, there will be some standing here alive who will not die until they see me coming in my kingdom. This generation. It's consistent. Jesus said when he would return. That's what he said. Now, here's what another thing or two I want to show you. So in Matthew chapter 24, let's skip ahead a little bit. We've already read about verse 3, where they asked the question, when will the end of the age be? Okay, so they asked the question, when will all of these things take place? What things? The destruction of Jerusalem, the vindication of the martyrs, the temple being destroyed. When will these things take place? Now notice what he says. And then they ask, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming? Your parousia, by the way. What was parousia? Look it up. What will be the sign of your parousia? Your second coming, as many would refer to it. It's the advent, as is defined. It's when Jesus comes back. And they ask, when will this be? And the end of the age, not the end of the world. If it had been world, they would use the specific word for world. It was age, the end of the age. Got it? So Jesus answered unto him, see to it that no one misleads you. For many, this is verse 5, Matthew 24. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. And he gives all of these signs. So he's answering this. Here's the sign. People are going to come saying, I'm the Christ. Well, when did they do that? In the first century. It was all over the place. People claimed to be Messiah. There were lots of emperors who claimed to be gods. I don't think that's necessarily the same thing, but that was going on. Supernatural things taking place, which is a whole other study, but let me put it this way. The miraculous gifts of the Spirit were to come to an end when Jesus returns. Now, those miraculous gifts of the Spirit, the miracles that could be performed, are not being performed today. So what does that mean? Jesus has already come. We'll leave more of that study for later. And I think I talked about that last week, maybe the week before. Okay, so Jesus said he gives them all of these signs. Notice what he says in verse 15. When you see the abomination of desolation was spoken through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So he says this is what Daniel was talking about. And he quotes Daniel. Listen to this. In verse 21, he says, for there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. What's this great tribulation that's going to happen? He's still answering this question. It's one question. When will the vindication of martyrs take place? When will the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple take place? Those are the things he talked about before they asked the question. So he's saying, here's the signs. And he quotes Daniel. Why would he quote Daniel? Because Daniel prophesied about this. Let's go to Daniel chapter 12. Okay, so Daniel chapter 12, and we're going to look at two verses, the first two. Actually, we're going to look at more than that, but you have to understand. I think a lot of people think that Jesus, when he spoke, and the apostles when they spoke, that everything that they were talking about was brand new. When in fact, it's all fulfillment of prophecy. Recall what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. He said, I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came to fulfill. He said, heaven and earth will not pass away until every jot, and I'm just paraphrasing, every jot and every tittle, every crossing of a T. This really isn't a good illustration, but it's decent for English. Every crossing of a T and every dotting of an I is fulfilled. What you have to understand that every stroke of the quill in Hebrew meant something. It was a sentence in itself, and it had meaning. So you could have a symbol of a letter that looks identical to another symbol, except for one small, tiny stroke, and that completely changes all of it. Gives it a different meaning. It's actually amazing the way God designed Hebrew. But either way, we're going to go to Daniel 12. I'm going to take a drink real quick. Okay. All right. Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2. Let's just read this. Now, at that time, because remember, we were just in Matthew 24, and Jesus said that, sorry, guys, I got to correct this camera. I'm probably a little too close to it. Jesus had quoted Daniel. Matthew interjects, and he says, let the reader understand. In other words, go back and read Daniel. This is the exact same thing that Peter said in 2 Peter 3 about when they were saying, what about the promise of the coming of the Lord? He said he was coming. Well, where's it at? He hasn't come. The first 2 verses in 2 Peter 3 say, go back and read the prophets. So what do we got to do? We've got to go back and read the prophets. We've got to see where their source material is. What are they quoting? What's the context of it? So Jesus quotes Daniel, and here's what Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2 say. This is the only place in the Old Testament that talks about this, right? So here we go. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2 is talking about the time when this distress comes upon the earth, such as never was seen before. Jesus adds a little bit of Joel 2 in there too, when he says, or never will again, indicating even more time when these events were beginning. Now, what do we see? Daniel 12, 1 and 2. At the time of the distress, such as never been seen or ever will be again, Jesus said that was going to happen in the first century. Nobody disagrees. If you look at Matthew 24, they'll say up through verse 34, 35, depending on who you're talking to, is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Why they say that, I don't know. I'm going to show you something in a minute when we go back over there. Why they say that, I don't know. But Jesus was going to come for judgment on the clouds with his angels in the glory of his Father, and the resurrection was going to take place, and he said it would happen in their lifetime. Their lifetime, not ours, in their lifetime. Because it was prophesied here. Let's read it again. Daniel 12, 1. Now at that time, Michael the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Now listen to this. At that time, what time? That's the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. Because remember, it's never going to happen again. And it's never been as bad as it ever was until that time. So that eliminates every time up until 70, when it was finally and forever, never to be rebuilt, destroyed. So at that time, your people, everyone who's found written in the book, will be rescued. Rescued from what? Rescued from this. This is going to require a lot more time. So I'll just be brief, very brief. Rescued from separation from God in the Hadean realm, or in Sheol. Or Isaiah 59, 1 and 2, Isaiah chapter 1, both talk about this idea of being separated because of our sins that happened in the garden with Adam. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting what, about verse 21 or something like that, and following. Because of our sins and our sinful nature, guess what? We need a rescuing because we were separated from God. And at that time, they're going to be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. Well, who are sleeping in the dust of the ground? What does that mean? These are the dead people. Romans chapter 3, 5, almost 5. Yeah, I hate it when I do that. Says that death reigned from Adam till Moses. Romans 5, verse 14, I think it is. Let me verify this for you. Yeah, Romans 5, verse 14, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam till Moses. This death that's being talked about here is that separation that occurred in the garden until the law of Moses came to an end. And that was in 70, by the way. I know I'm bringing up lots of different things here, and I don't have time to explain all them because I want to kind of stay focused on this. But death reigned from that time. That passage confused me and confounded me for years, until then I come to an understanding of Sheol and where people were, and that death was going to reign until the end of Moses. Anyway, so we go back to Daniel chapter 12. Who are these people who are sleeping in the dust of the ground? And they will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. This is the judgment of the just and the unjust. Those to life, those to destruction. Those to life, those to everlasting contempt, according to this translation. When does that take place? He says it very clear. At the time of distress, such as never been seen, will be seen. And as Jesus said, never will be seen again. When did that happen? This was the question that the apostles, the disciples asked in Matthew 24 and verse 3. When will these events take place? What will be the sign of these things and the sign of your parousia? They understood that the parousia of the Lord was going to take place in their lifetime, and they wanted to know the signs. They wanted to know, what are the signs of your parousia and the end of the age? Did they expect the end of the age to come in their lifetime? You better believe they did if they listened to the preaching of Jesus. And Jesus said, what did he say? I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. When was the law going to come to the end? When every jot and every tittle was fulfilled. All right. So Daniel chapter 12 teaches clearly that Jesus was coming in conjunction with Matthew 24, as we read earlier, just a few moments ago, that Jesus was coming when? At the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. But notice this, that in Daniel chapter 12, let's skip down to verse 5. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on the bank of the river and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? Well, what wonders? We just read what they were, the first two verses. When will these things be finished? When will they come to their completion? And verse 7 says, I heard a man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for time, times, and half a time. As soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. Well, what's the power of the holy people? Great in every respect. Romans chapter 3, the first few verses there teach. Great in every respect. It was the word of Moses, that covenant of Moses, and that the Jews were entrusted with that. Check that out, and you'll see that's absolutely what this is talking about. So they finished shattering the power of the holy people. When was the power of the holy people shattered? And if you're going to say that the holy people are Christians, then they're going to have to shatter the power of Christians, which is the gospel, which, by the way, endures forever. Ephesians chapter 3 teaches it's the eternal purpose of God. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9 all teach that this will be something permanent, this kingdom, this gospel. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 9. The increase of his government will never end. Never end. So when is this going? This can't be the Christians, or you're going to have to shatter the power of the gospel. That makes no sense. But Jesus said, I came to fulfill it. When I do that, it's taken out of the way. It's completely destroyed. When was that to take place? In 70 AD, when they finished shattering the power of the holy people. That was Jerusalem. That was the temple. And that's when these things were going to take place. Now, let's go back to Matthew chapter 24. So, to illustrate that Jesus was coming in their future, their soon future, their near future, their at-hand future, their mellow future, this was about to happen. To illustrate this, Jesus says, notice what he says in verse 29. Now remember, before we read this, let me give you a refresher course, Matthew 16, 27 and 28. The Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now let's read Matthew chapter 24 and verse 29. Immediately after I want to back up. Verse 25, behold, I told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the parousia of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So what's he talking about? This advent, this second coming in our terminology of the Lord. He uses the term, not me. He's the one that used it. Wherever the vultures gather, where the corpse is, the vultures will gather there. That's the some versions say eagle. It should be eagles, I think. But it's the Roman. The Romans were there. What were they doing around all these corpses? Destroying Jerusalem and the temple. But notice what it says. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. What did we just read in Matthew 16, 27, 28? Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man. What did we read in Matthew 16, 27 and 28 about seeing the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory? These are all the exact same constituent elements that we find in Matthew 16, verses 27 and 28. And here Jesus repeats them again and saying that it's going to happen at the destruction of Jerusalem, that you will see the Son of Man coming in glory in the clouds of the sky for judgment. And when that happens, what did Daniel chapter 12, what did Jesus say to go back and refer to in Daniel 12? When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, realize what? That judgment's coming, resurrection is going to happen. Those who sleep in the dust of the ground will arise at the time of the shattering of the power of the holy people. When is this time of the shattering of the power of the holy people? The shattering of the power of the Jews being fulfilled. Everything fulfilled. If that's not the case, and Jesus didn't return, by the way, are there any passages in the Old Testament that talk about Jesus and his second coming or his parousia? Yes. If they haven't been fulfilled, then that old covenant law is still in effect. And you can't parse it out. You can't say, oh, well, the ceremonial part's gone and the moral law continues. No. Jesus said, when it's all fulfilled, it's all done. Simple. Very simple. You just have to accept it. That's the biggest problem. Okay, so let's keep reading. Verse 31 of Matthew 24. And he will send forth his angels. Wait a minute. The angels, did we read that in Matthew 16, 27, 28? With a great trumpet, and they will gather together the elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. That's resurrection. So if you're going to go with the theory that says that everything from Matthew 24, verse 1 through verse 35 is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, I don't know how you put verse 35 in there out of all honesty, but some do. And you're going to say that all is pertaining to the destruction of Jerusalem? I agree with you, because Jesus said he's going to gather all of the faithful from the four winds. That's Ezekiel 37 language, guys. That's resurrection language. We see this consistently. They're being gathered. That's resurrection. And it happens at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, the shattering of the power of the holy people, Daniel chapter 12, the entire chapter. So when he says in verse 32, listen to what he says. Now learn the parable of the fig tree when its branches already become tender and puts forth its leaves. You know that summer is near. So too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the doors. He's right at the doors. Oh, man. He's right at the doors. Who's right at the doors? It's the judge. Correct this camera again. I don't know what's going on with that thing. There we go. Let me show you something. Do you think that in the first century, they believed it was going to be 2,000 years later? Turn over with me to James. Ready for this? James chapter 4. James chapter 5. James chapter 5. If you look here, the latter part of verse 3, it is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. What last days? The days they were living in. Hebrews 1 talks about in these last days, okay? So, it is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields and which has been withheld by you. That's Malachi 3. Malachi 3 is talking about the coming of the herald of Jesus, who is according to Malachi 3 and chapter 4, Elijah. And Elijah was to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Well, what is the great and terrible day of the Lord? He just quoted Malachi chapter 3 in verse 4 of James 5. And he says, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did not, or who did the harvesting, has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. There's the persecution of the martyrs. Isn't this what Jesus just said? And he was telling them about this, and he was preaching this while he was still alive. Now, why do you suppose James is talking about these things? Listen, verse 7. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. This was not written to us today. James said, I'm writing this, James chapter 1 and verse 1. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad. Who's he writing it to? Not to me and you. And I wonder why the people in the first century believed that Jesus was coming in their lifetime. I wonder why it is all these Bible school professors don't even like to talk about this. So they say, this is perplexing. And you read the commentaries and they go, I don't get it. And they try to come up with something. It means what Jesus said it means. That's consistency. That's unity of scriptures. That's letting scriptures interpret scriptures, by the way. Verse 7, James 5, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. I know it's 9:01 and I'm trying to get this. The farmer waits till the precious produce of the soil, but be patient about it until the early and late rains. He's quoting Joel 2. What's Joel 2 talking about? Check it out. You too be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord, or the parousia of the Lord, is near. Now, what did the apostles ask? When will be your parousia? And here's James, and he says, the parousia is near. Wait a minute. Now listen to this. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Judge what? At the judgment day. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. Where did we just read that? Wasn't that in the Olivet Discourse? In what many of just about everybody in who claims to be a Christian today, they know anything about the scriptures, they're going to say, well, Matthew 24 is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. I agree. It is. It is. James quoted it. He verified it. And he said, the judge is right at the door. He's right there. I'm telling you what, just absolutely amazing stuff. So did they lie to us? The answer to that is yes and no. I think there's good meaning preachers and our parents, and my parents too. My mom has come to see this. I'm working on my dad, but sometimes it's just hard to let go of the paradigms. It's just hard to let go. And I'm begging you, let go of what men teach. You know, most of what I was taught, the big majority of what I was taught growing up in the Church of Christ was 100% right, but they got eschatology wrong. Most of our brethren, the ones who sit in the pews, I'm here to tell you from my personal experience, things that I've read, people I've talked to in the Church of Christ, the ones who sit in the pews, most of them believe in premillennialism. The ones who stand up in the pulpit and write the commentaries and run the churches teach amillennialism. There's no consistency. That's not a good thing. We need to be consistent. All right. I'm just going to leave it there. I hope that what you've seen here tonight is convincing. Not that I'm convincing you, but that Jesus convinced you. These were all his words. I wasn't taking any things out of context. I was very careful to keep them in context. I was very careful to show you their origin prophecies. Where did they get their information from? What was Jesus talking about? What was he quoting? Peter said, I meant to mention that, but Matthew was very specific in saying, and Jesus was very specific in saying, Matthew 24, that this is what Daniel was talking about. That is consistent. It's not all over the board. So what do you have to live for? That's what everybody said. Well, where's my hope? Don't get mad at me, but you will probably. You don't have any hope today. You have something better than hope. Fulfillment. You know what you're looking for in the future? Your hope to be fulfilled? What if you came to realize that's already been fulfilled? And now you're not looking for it. You're not waiting for salvation to come in the future. Yeah, yes, you are. You're waiting for salvation to come in the future with Jesus. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 28 says he will appear a second time for salvation. And that perplexes people. They go, I don't know what that means, but I'm saved now. It's because you understand it partly, but you don't get it fully because you're not letting go of the paradigms that detract from what Jesus taught while he was alive. You have fulfillment. That's a whole lot better than hope. I don't have to hope for salvation. Now, I can have it now. I can be seated with Jesus in heavenly places. I can be baptized into Jesus Christ and clothed in him, according to Galatians 3:26 and 27. I can be resurrected today to have a new life now, not somewhere in the future after I rot for a few millennia in the Hadean realm. Get it? We have fulfillment now. That's a whole lot better than hope. We have a whole lot more than hope. Hope was for the Jews, and their hope was in resurrection. Paul actually said that. Our hope is in the resurrection of the dead. Not our hope. Paul said the hope of the Jews is in the resurrection of the dead. Ezekiel 37 teaches clearly that resurrection that was to take place was the whole house of Israel. If you're waiting for resurrection, that kind of a resurrection and a physical and bodily resurrection, you're waiting for something that will never happen. You're saved spiritually, not physically. If that's the case, then my leg wouldn't be hurting. I wouldn't have to deal with all the diseases that I got to deal with and all the everyday aches and pains, and I would live forever. Death reigned from Adam until Moses. Once the law of Moses ended, death no longer reigns. What does that mean? We already talked about that, and I'll wind up going on another half an hour. Let me leave it this way. I love y'all. I love y'all. I love y'all. I have a tremendous amount of respect for anyone who opens up this Word of God and has a respect for it and tries to find their salvation in it and to understand what God did and the price that was paid. If you're working out your salvation with fear and trembling, kudos to you. You join a very small group of people on this planet who is willing to do such a thing. Matthew chapter 7 is very clear about that. 3 separate instances, he talks about that very concept. But that way is broad that leads to destruction. And how many people just enter that and they go that way? They don't even realize they're going that way. But the one who finds eternal life is looking for that small way. You see, they're searching. And you have to do so diligently. And I commend you for doing that. If you are of such a mind tonight, I commend you for that. And you just keep on studying. Be back with us next week. Going to be here. We're going to talk about some more stuff. I don't know what it's going to be, but I'll come up with something. And matter of fact, I didn't even know what I was going to talk about. This whole injury thing's got me so scrambled in my head that I don't even realize what day it is after a month of doing nothing at all and just being totally out of it. But anyway, so I didn't even know what I was going to talk about until about 7:30 tonight or a little bit later. But it worked out, and I think it was a good study, and I hope you have been edified from it and realize that you can have salvation. And you can taste that sweet gift now and be seated with Jesus in heavenly places. I want to encourage you to do that by being added to the body as they were in the first century, as Paul wrote to the Galatian brethren and so many others, to be baptized into Christ, to enter that body. Outside of that, I'm going to leave you with all that. Be with us next week, 8 o'clock. Tell all your friends. Share this video. This is also on Restoration Movement 2.0 on YouTube. It might be a little easier to find there, and the quality might be a little better. But if you can find it on Facebook, more power to you, because I don't know how to do that. Yeah, I'm trying to figure all this stuff out. So we will see you next time. Love everybody, and don't forget, study to show yourselves approved unto the Lord. That's what this is all about. We'll see you next time.